Morning and welcome to our virtual event, the Diplomats Roundtable, Iran and Israel at War. I'm Jonathan Panikoff, Director of the Scowcroft Middle East Security Initiative here at the Atlantic Council, and we're thrilled to have you with us wherever you're joining from across the globe. It's hard to believe that it hasn't even been 1 week since the war between Israel and Iran began. In that time, we have seen Israel strike throughout Iran against the country's nuclear program, ballistic missile production sites and launchers, and against individual targets, including military leaders, political officials, and scientists. The Iranian media reports that there's been over 200 killed in the country. In turn, Iran has responded with missile barrages on Israeli cities and civilian populations, especially in the north and central of Israel. They've had multiple attempted drone strikes, which thus far have been unsuccessful. And the Israelis report that there have been 24 people killed and hundreds more injured across the country. But make no mistake, the implications for this conflict go far beyond the immediate kinetic strikes. This is a war that the potential has to fundamentally shape the trajectory of the Middle East for years to come, depending on how it concludes. The regional balance of power, nuclear proliferation, long-term regional security, political, economic, commercial opportunities, and challenges are all on the table. And to unpack all of this and more, I'm thrilled to have the opportunity to moderate today's conversation with five of the most experienced and insightful diplomats and Middle East experts around. Ambassador Nicholas Hopton is the former British ambassador to Iran, Libya, Qatar, and Yemen, and is an incoming non-resident senior fellow with us here at the Scowcroft Middle East Security Initiative. Ambassador Paul Foley is the former Australian ambassador to Iran, Afghanistan, Timor-Leste, and for counterterrorism, and a member of our Iran Strategy Project Advisory Committee. Ambassador Rob McCare is a former British ambassador to Iran as well as the former High Commissioner to Kenya, and he too is a member of our Iran Strategy Project Advisory Committee. Ambassador Alina Romanowski is the former U.S. ambassador to Iraq and Kuwait, former principal deputy coordinator for counterterrorism, and an incoming non-resident senior fellow with us. And Ambassador Dan Shapiro is the former U.S. ambassador to Israel, more recently, the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for the Middle East, and today is a distinguished fellow with us here at SMESI. Welcome to you all. We have a lot to get to. Let's start with this. Ambassador McCare, you were in Tehran representing Her Majesty's government when President Trump withdrew the U.S. from the JCPOA in May of 2018. Later that year began the maximum pressure campaign. But you were also there when he ordered the killing of Qasem Soleimani, the leader of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard's Quds Force, which, for those unaware, is roughly analogous to a mix between CIA paramilitary and joint special operations forces. Ambassador, you know this regime as well as anyone. Yesterday, President Trump said Iran's unconditional surrender was required. This morning, the Supreme Leader responded on a series of Twitter tweets. He said that if the U.S. strikes, there will be irreparable damage. How are Iranian leaders likely thinking through and going to read not only the president's comments in private, but what does it mean in terms of the potential for diplomatic talks, which there's been some reporting Iran actually does want to resume? What does it mean from where we go from here?
Thanks very much, Jonathan. And you've obviously assembled a great collection of people here, and in Paul and Nick and myself, you've got a sequence of people who've been posted in Tehran. So I don't claim any monopoly of wisdom on this. But the question you ask about how Iran and the top leadership of Iran will be thinking about the situation is absolutely crucial at the moment. And one of the things that's worth thinking about is that the Iranian system studies American politics very closely, and obviously has an existential interest in doing so, particularly at times like this. But I can remember Abbas Araghchi, the current foreign minister, coming across in a presidential office one day and sitting next to me and saying, "Can you explain President Trump to me? He's saying one thing and his Secretary of State is saying something else, and which should we believe?" And but they they do have a they do have a very, very close understanding of how American politics works. But I'm not sure that the same always applies in the other direction at the political level. And I think that how Iran will be responding to the threats and the deployment of military assets that they're seeing now from the US while under attack from Israel is I think we should start from the starting point, the assumption that resistance will be the default setting for the regime. And this is not just an ideological commitment. It is a sort of core ideological function for the regime to be resisting the West. This is not a regime that has ever caved to pressure alone, and it sees it as part of its reason for being to resist that pressure. So the defiant rhetoric we saw from Khamenei in response to the president's comments, absolutely to be expected. And the regime in Tehran, it's not Hezbollah. I mean, they've taken a lot of senior people have been taken out, but this is a regime that has a lot of depth and a lot of structure to it, and has thought about this and prepared for this. So I think they will continue to be defiant, and I think that their options may be very limited. I know other people will come on and speak about this in a moment, but I think we should assume that defiance will be the setting that they come from, not least because if they look weak, that itself is a threat to regime survival, and everything is seen as a regime survival question. So I don't think that we should expect unconditional surrender in the terms that the president has demanded it. However, we all know that, again, this regime, when it actually comes down to it, they have shown they can be pretty flexible at times, and they can be pretty agile. So they may pivot. But this is going to come down, I think, to us understanding in both directions. It's not just whether we can all understand what's going on inside the minds of the top Iranian decision makers, it's whether they can interpret the signals they're getting from the US and whether what they see as a bluff and what they see as a real threat, and where they go. So that would be my take on that question, Jonathan.
Ambassador, thank you. Let me turn to you, Ambassador Foley. You heard Ambassador Macaire talk about regime survival, and I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that Tehran is in its most challenging position now that it has been in years. Regime survival has always been the overriding priority. Assuming you agree with that, what are the actions that you're expecting the regime might be trying to take behind the scenes in order to ensure that they do survive this tumult and this period?
Thanks, Jonathan. And I do agree with Rob that the regime is motivated by survival, and it's currently facing the greatest threat it's ever faced, and it will paint survival, if it does survive, as victory. The regime has a weak hand and few friends, but will likely try to outlast the attack, land a few punches of its own, and seek to improve its position in any subsequent negotiations, as well as strengthening the regime's internal narrative of resistance in terms of not looking weak, as Rob mentioned. In terms of what they're actually doing to ensure the regime's survival, my guess would be that they'll be undertaking a number of actions. Firstly, they'll be seeking to husband and protect as much military and industrial strength as they can, including the nuclear infrastructure, trying to preserve it for the future. As I said, they'll want to get in some blows against Israel and anyone else that gets involved in order to try to bring the hostilities to a close. They'll be paying some attention, although it's not really clear to me how much in terms of messaging to the population, but also in terms of internal messaging to a regime audience to underline the imperative of resistance. I think they will certainly be alert to any signs of internal dissent. And there's been some coverage on arrests, what they amount to or not. It's not quite clear. And certainly I think they would love to be able to capture a pilot if they were able to do so. That would give them a very substantial card to play with Israel in terms of what they need to do.
Thank you very much. We'll certainly be turning back to that. I think that's a critical point about whether or not the regime is able to fulfill all of those goals, and what does it mean if it doesn't. But let me first turn to Ambassador Hopton. I want to stick on the Iran side of the equation here for just a moment more, but the focus here in DC today is obviously significantly on the potential for the U.S. to join Israel in a military campaign against Iran. We know yesterday, President Trump held an NSC meeting with his cabinet. Rumors are flying about whether or not Washington will join the kinetic fight immediately, maybe in the future, maybe not at all. It's not clear how intense the involvement would be if Washington did join. You made an interesting assessment yesterday during an interview with Bloomberg Television, and for those in the audience who may not have seen it, let me just quote it. You said, if you saw the U.S. come in and there were attacks on Iran's nuclear facilities and doing the real damage that Israel is probably incapable of doing, at that point, the escalation would ramp up considerably. Ambassador, what is your view as to what that escalation would actually look like? What are Iran's retaliatory options? And perhaps most important, what would the Iranian decision-making process look like in deciding to respond and how far to go?
Thank you, Jonathan. I think, as you said, there's a big focus on what decision President Trump will take in Washington and weighing all the options. And I think the same is probably going on in Tehran with the advisors around the supreme leader at the top of the regime, weighing the options, weighing what would be the best course of action to achieve the objectives that Rob talked about, resistance and resilience, and regime survival, which of course is the top priority. Now, those options include escalation. They also include, if the US were to come in and drop bunker-busting bombs with the Israelis and actually take out Fordo nuclear facility, which would start to make credible claims of ending Iran's nuclear capability, at least in the short term. If that were to happen, the Iranians will be weighing options. And one of those options might well be capitulation, given that the regime has clearly not got the military might to defeat or do much more against Israel and are gradually being degraded. It's asymmetric in quality and quantity against Israel. And with the Americans, it would be overwhelming militarily, at least in the air. So one option would be capitulation. And I think if President Trump were to send negotiators, as looks likely Steve Witkoff may be heading, to have at least an indirect conversation with Abbas Araghchi, the foreign minister, in the coming days, then maybe capitulation, surrender, dressed up as a deal. It would have to be presented correctly, and it's unhelpful if the Israelis continue to talk about complete victory or surrender, because that will be very difficult for the Iranians to swallow. But if there was a deal, that's one option. On the other side, escalation, as you were asking, Jonathan, could involve, in the immediate term, closing the Straits of Hormuz. The Iranians have done that before. It would be very straightforward for them to disrupt shipping traffic through the Straits of Hormuz, with an immediate impact on the markets globally, on the oil price, and on the regional dynamic as well, because of course the Gulf countries on the other side of the Gulf are dependent also on using that channel through the Straits of Hormuz for their energy exports. But there could be more escalatory and damaging options as well. Iran has not used all its cards. It still has proxies, albeit very weakened and decapitated in the case of Hezbollah and Hamas. The Houthi are still firing. They may well have other cards up their sleeves. So it's far from clear which option the Supreme Leader will take. Maybe he'll choose to go for capitulation dressed up as a deal in the hope of fighting another day, or maybe at this stage the calculation will be that it's best to escalate further and prolong the fighting as long as possible.
Ambassador Romanowski, Ambassador Hopton just talked about Iran not having played all of its cards and some weakened proxies, but proxies that still exist. Obviously, some of those proxies are in Iraq. You left Iraq not long ago as the U.S. ambassador. You served there, you served in the Gulf. What's your sense about how Iraq and Gulf allies are handling this moment? Is the private messaging the same as the public messaging in your estimation? And what is their ultimate preference, their ultimate goal? Is it unified across Gulf allies? And what could the proxy attacks look like, especially in a place like Iraq, if there was that sort of escalation that Ambassador Hopton was talking about?
Well, thanks, Jonathan. Let me talk a little bit in a broad sense at first, especially focused on, our Gulf states, obviously the ones most regionally close to the conflict. Ultimately, I think the Gulf states really want this to be over, or at least turn down to a really low boil. At all costs, they want to avoid a spillover of attacks on their soil, specifically attacks that are ultimately going to challenge U.S. presence. So they don't want to see this escalating to a point where the Iranians may have to respond to attacks on U.S. facilities in any of our presence in the Gulf, our personnel, our forces. That's just something they don't want to even have to deal with. Yes, that's something that could happen. It's in the escalatory turns, but I think if they can avoid it, and they're going to try to do that, because ultimately they don't want the United States to pull out of the region, and they also don't want fundamentally to reduce our presence there, because at the end, this is we are their bulwark against the Iranian malign influence in the region. At the end of the day, they're going to lean towards diplomacy as the solution. They've seen it work before. So I think publicly they're going to, yes, there will be differences, of course, based on their relationships with Iran, their interests, their ability to communicate clearly with the Iranian regime. But at the end of the day, they know that the United States is pretty much the only country that can bring an end to this, or a ceasefire, or an end to the cycle here. And so behind the scenes, they're going to be trying very hard to shape our response. Not sure it's going to be 100% successful, because after all, we have this administration has their America First policy that they want to make sure that they are, first of all, seen as making those decisions. They also look to the United States, frankly, and some of our other allies, in Europe and in Asia, Australians, others, to exert pressure on Israel. And so it wouldn't surprise me if there are also those conversations going on about finding a solution to this. Whether we can turn to our Gulf partners and actually bring them into this diplomacy actively is something that I don't think it's not clear to me that we have enough relationships built yet to be able to actually send some of our Gulf friends out there to do some of the diplomacy proactively, as opposed to them talking to us. However, I do think that they could be, again, partners in this conversation. They know the Iranian regime very well, so obviously some of the Gulfies, the Saudis, the Emiratis, the Omanis, can counsel and can engage in, I think, constructive discussions. Whether both sides or all sides agree, that's something very different, but certainly they can be another important voice in terms of why this situation has to come to some sort of closure. Let's face it, I don't think anybody wants to see an Iran with a nuclear capability, so at least they're on the same page on that with us and with others. Let me turn a little bit to Iraq, and frankly, I'll say a few words about Syria, and I know others here have thoughts on how Syria is looking at this. Neither Iraq or Syria, which are both sandwiched between Iran and Israel, want to be dragged into this conflict. And in fact, in Baghdad's case, the Prime Minister Soudani has tried very hard since even October 7th to avoid the conflict expanding on its soil. Yes, their aligned-backed Iraqi militias have launched attacks. That has quieted over the last, I would say, 6 months or so, because it's very clear it is not in Iraq's interest to get in the fray. I would say, for all intents and purposes, the axis of resistance is pretty defunct. It does have a few stalwart participants, as you all know, but I think that by and large, the Iraqi political elite, while they don't particularly like the decision, are standing down, and they don't need it. They don't need to get involved. They have an election coming up in November. They have a lot of domestic issues they need to deal with, and that's, I think, where they want to keep the focus. Baghdad itself, other than making public statements and sending letters to the UN about overflight and closing their airspace, fundamentally they can't do much about it, but they still, for their own internal domestic audience, needs to be able to seen as taking some steps to do this. And for Syria, I would say pretty much the same thing under the Shara government. They don't need to be dragged in to this either. I think the Shara's government has very little incentive in taking its eyes off consolidating its power and stabilizing Syria. That's what Shara wants to do. So they already know the capability of Israel next door, and so why get in the fray when they don't have to at the moment? Because if they do take and they do allow things to happen, this is really going to derail the gains that he's made, not only with the regional leadership, but also with U.S. efforts to establish better ties. So if they can sit it out, they're going to sit it out. But I will also caution that their rogue elements are very unpredictable. But Iraqis and many of its political leaders are well aware of both the signals and the threats that the Israeli government has sent most recently, but also since October 7th. And I think they are much more interested in sitting this out. Diplomacy, I think, is what they're really going to look for. And if they can, and if the Gulf states can be helpful, they are absolutely going to be, both in helping to shape the understanding within the U.S. government on how to deal with the Iranians, but also the stakes that are high. And probably the highest stake, the way I see it, is if we are attacked, there is no doubt that this administration, as previous administrations, will respond. And the ultimate concern would be, of course, that we have to change our posture and leave the region, which leaves everyone in a very difficult state. I'll stop there, and I'm sure we'll get questions later. Thanks.
Thank you very much. And before I turn to Ambassador Shapiro, just a reminder for those of you watching with us online, if you do have a question later on, please do send it to @askac.org. We'll be taking questions from our audience across the globe and look forward to that a little later in the program. Ambassador Shapiro, we've been talking a little bit about Iranian thinking, about some of the possible diplomacy. Let's turn to kind of the core issue of where we are today, though. Obviously, the question on whether or not Fordo is going to be attacked, whether or not the Israelis can do it ingeniously and creatively, somehow on their own, whether the U.S. might be pulled in. A few days ago, I know it feels like a year ago, but on Saturday, you were on PBS News Weekend, and I want to highlight something you said for those who may not have seen it. You said, I don't think regime change is a realistic goal, and probably not even a legitimate goal to try to pursue through military means, whether by Israel or the United States or others. Israel, as we were just noting, is quite clear. Its primary goal is to destroy, or at minimum, very significantly set back Iran's nuclear program, as well as its ballistic missile capability. But with that said, when we think about what comes next and the potential for military action, the potential for U.S. involvement, there's been lots of discussion here in D.C. the last day or two, especially about what the U.S. terms kind of mission creep. And there's been reporting. I don't think any of us at the Atlantic Council can corroborate it, but there is reporting from reliable journalists that Prime Minister Netanyahu may have sought to potentially kill the supreme leader and is waved off doing so by President Trump. You know Israel as well as anyone. What is Israel's potential motivation for regime change? What is Jerusalem's strategic thinking for how it would play out, what it would mean for Israel, even beyond the military objectives that are more immediate related to the Iranian nuclear program and ballistic missile capability?
Thanks, Jonathan. So for I think most Israelis in the government and the security establishment and probably among the Israeli public, the fundamental problem is the Iranian regime. It's a regime that, of course, calls openly for Israel's destruction, does seek this nuclear capability that might give them the ability to carry out that terrible vision, has operated and funded and trained and armed the Axis of Resistance, all the different terrorist organizations over the years, some of them now quite damaged after Israel's campaign since October 7th. And at the end of the day, they assess that that regime will continue in whatever fashion it can for as long as it exists to pursue its ideological agenda, which includes Israel's destruction. That said, that's not the goal of the campaign that they set out on 6 days ago. What they set out on 6 days ago was a military campaign designed to cause maximum damage to the Iranian nuclear program, as well as to other Iranian capabilities, specifically their ballistic missile program and their air defenses. That's been the bulk of the work so far done by the Israeli Air Force and, of course, Israeli intelligence services that have also participated. And I think they feel to this point that they've had a significant amount of success. I think we all recognize that, borne out by tremendous penetration of the Iranian system, the ability to smuggle in drones to attack air defense sites in the early hours, that then accelerated Israel's ability to achieve real air dominance, air superiority, which by day 2 they really had established. I think now Israeli jets are flying above the skies of Tehran and most of Western Iran pretty much at will. I do believe there was one UAV downed by an Iranian surface-to-air missile, maybe just today. But as far as the manned aircraft, they've barely been challenged, and I think they feel they've had a lot of success with that. Obviously, on the nuclear facilities, they have struck Natanz, both the above ground enrichment facility, as well as where the 60% enrichment takes place. That seems to have been destroyed and have done some damage. It's not clear if it's with a direct strike or with cuts to the power source to the underground facility, but there seems to have been a significant damage at Natanz. At Esfahan, the uranium conversion facility has also been destroyed, and various other laboratories and assembly lines for devices to produce centrifuges and other nuclear materials have also been targeted. So I think they feel even if things were to stop today, and even without Fordo totally addressed, which of course is very critical because Iran does have the ability still to produce a breakout capability just at the Fordo site, I do think they feel they've set back this program and put some time on the clock for how quickly Iran would be able to actually produce a weapon or break out and then weaponize. Of course, they've also gone after various high-value targets, regime figures, IRGC, and military leaders, and the most important nuclear scientists and other scientific leadership associated with the nuclear program. I think that has also added to the sense that they would be able to put time on the clock for how long it would take Iran to break out even if the war were to stop almost immediately. I mentioned the successes of the air defense array that has really been rendered quite ineffective now. By the way, that's relevant to the consideration that the U.S. military would have if and when they received an order from President Trump to participate in any way, including with a strike against Fordo, because obviously any U.S. action would want to take care of suppressing enemy air defenses as part of a preparation for such a strike. Clearly, a significant amount of that work has been done by the Israeli Air Force. And then the big hunt that the Israelis are on right now is for the launchers of the ballistic missiles. That's of course, main vector that Iran has been able to use to attack Israel and to do significant damage. You mentioned, I think, 24 deaths, hundreds of injuries, hundreds of homes destroyed, significant physical damage, also to some infrastructure, I believe an oil refinery. And I'm sure there are sites that we don't know about, air bases and others that may have sustained at least some kinds of damage. But that is what the Israelis are trying to eliminate as much as possible are the launchers. There are obviously fewer launchers than there are missiles, but to degrade Iran's capability to continue those attacks. At the same time, they are also working on striking the missile production lines for both the medium-range ballistic missiles, the ones that reach Israel, as well as the shorter-range ballistic missiles. These are those that could be used against targets in the Gulf, whether U.S. bases or whether infrastructure or oil facilities in the Gulf, and air defense assets if the Iranians try to regenerate that. And then there's been a little bit of signaling around national infrastructure, oil facilities, one oil terminal in Tehran, and one strike against a refinery further south. These are signs that the Israelis want the Iranians to be thinking about how much more damage could be done to the Iranian economy if this escalates and they feel they need to go that route. So that's been the campaign to this point. And I think the Israeli military leadership is more or less telling their political leadership that they're ahead of schedule. They didn't think they would have achieved this much this soon. They did not know they'd achieve air dominance as quickly. They certainly had to worry about whether they'd lose manned aircraft. And that they have maybe several more days worth of strikes that they would need to conduct to hit all the targets that they had previously selected for this phase. And that does not include a regime change through military means strategy. Now, this question of whether or not Prime Minister Netanyahu sought a green light from President Trump to take out the supreme leader is, of course, relevant to this question. It doesn't seem to be part of the current Israeli plan. But if he asked and if Trump said no, then, of course, it's in the discussion. Of course, President Trump himself, I think, tweeted yesterday that we know where the supreme leader is and have decided for now not to take any action against him. And this is additional to a number of other somewhat chaotic tweets about complete surrender, unconditional surrender, and several others. So it's a little hard to know where the president's thinking is on this. But I think, as I said on the PBS NewsHour that you mentioned, it really is not. I think a possible strategy, and I don't think it's a legitimate strategy, to try to execute a regime change through an aerial campaign. And I don't see any appetite in either Israel or in the United States to conduct a regime change of the style that the United States conducted in Iraq and Afghanistan 20 plus years ago. So I don't think that's on the table. Now, it's certainly possible. And I think maybe one could say one might hope for it. And our colleagues on the on the webinar who know the Iranian system and society much better than I. Would be interesting to hear their views. That at some point, if the regime appears weak, whether through the blows to these institutions kinetically, whether through the assassinations, or potentially through a negotiation. If Trump offers to return to negotiations, but he demands a full capitulation on dismantling the nuclear program, maybe that form of weakness. If any of that produces an uprising or a motivation for the many Iranian civilians who we know to test this regime and have protested previously or have been brutalized by it or resent the way it has squandered resources, not to benefit the Iranian people, but to pursue these ideological missions and terrorist campaigns overseas. That feels like it should be ripe, given how brittle a regime like this authoritarian Iranian regime might resemble previous brittle authoritarian regimes that have crumbled when under pressure. But I don't know that anybody who is an expert on this has identified regime fissures yet, has identified who might the leaders of an alternative movement be. I'm sure most Iranians at the moment, particularly in the Tehran area, are focused on personal safety, some trying to evacuate, again, based on another chaotic Trump tweet calling for the full evacuation of Tehran. So there are a lot of questions about what might trigger that event and whether that's even possible. But I think the more limited and more focused discussion at the moment within the Israeli system and between Israel and the United States is about continuing to fulfill the Israeli campaign's goals on the targets I mentioned, and then the ultimate question of Fordo and whether the United States, with its unique capabilities, would come in to do what Israel cannot do through aerial bombing. You mentioned the possibility that Israel has, through some other creative or ingenious solution, the ability to do significant damage at Fordo, and I would not rule it out. We've seen their success with the pager and walkie-talkie attacks against Hezbollah last year. We saw their commando raid against the Masyaf weapons production facility in Syria. We saw them smuggle the drones in to Iran early in this campaign. So we know Israel has tricks up its sleeve. We don't know for sure what they might be able to achieve at Fordo. But I think, of course, they would prefer to see President Trump take that decision and take that action on behalf of the United States. He clearly is in discussions with his national security team about it. I think there seems to be divisions within the administration and certainly within his political base about the wisdom of getting involved militarily, and of course the risks that come with that, including what the Supreme Leader seemed to threaten today, which would be strikes against U.S. forces as retaliation if the U.S. were to get involved. So those are big questions that the president has to navigate as he considers that decision. But I think they are separate from and really premature to any discussion of a kind of a formal policy or a formal effort by either Israel or the United States to force regime change to happen. That's something that maybe is hoped to be a derivative outcome, but not a direct goal of either a U.S. or an Israeli military campaign. I'll stop there.
Okay, Ambassador, thanks. So a lot to unpack from all five of you, and I want to start with this. We'll come back to regime change in a second and where the Iranian population is, because I think that's important. But before we do that, Ambassador Foley, when he was giving his initial remarks, talked about how the regime would view the fact of its survival, as well as the potential of some of the sites like Fordo actually not being struck, or a nuclear program remain in some form or not. So I want to ask this. Ambassador Shapiro, just quickly, and then I want to get the Iranian side of this from Ambassador Foley. If Fordo remains, in other words, if Fordo ends up not being significantly damaged, can Israel or should Israel walk away viewing this operation and viewing this war as a success? Or will it be fundamentally a failure, that it didn't achieve its actual objectives to really destroy the Iranian nuclear program? Maybe set it back, but not actually to destroy it.
I think if Fordo is untouched, the campaign has not achieved Israel's objective. They want the end state to be, as the prime minister kind of described, before this all began, the Libya model. I think that's how he applied to the negotiations that preceded the campaign, what he's looking for, a full dismantlement. Of course, President Trump had set as the standard in the negotiations themselves a zero enrichment outcome after some wobbling around whether that was the U.S. position, but it seemed to be where it was. And so I think if Iran retains the enrichment capability at Fordo, which includes to 60% and could be to weapons grade at a time of their choosing, they really still retain that breakout capability on a very short duration, or days to weeks. They could produce the weapons grade uranium for multiple bombs. Now, that's still separate from the weaponization process, and it's almost certain that the other damage Israel has done to other parts of the program has put time on the clock to actually marry up weapons grade uranium with a weapon assembled and deliverable. So it is probably true that even if things stop today with Fordo relatively untouched, there have been gains, and there has been time added to the clock to actually worry about Iran having a deployable nuclear weapon. But I don't think Fordo untouched is sort of an outcome that meets the Israeli objective of really preventing Iran from having that breakout capability. And it doesn't meet the objective President Trump had set out in the negotiations. So that's a big dilemma for both Netanyahu and Trump. Is there an end state to this conflict that leaves Fordo still operational? And for both of them, I think it would fall short of what they wanted to achieve.
Ambassador Foley, let me ask you the flip side of that. For the Iranians, if Fordo remains either relatively untouched or just minimally damaged, is it a success for the Iranian regime? And so then if Fordo is destroyed, either by Israel, is this a complete disaster for the Iranian regime? Is there credibility, given that they spent so much time talking about the nuclear program as a matter of integrity and a matter of principle in Tehran and for the Iranian people? Does it undermine the regime itself?
If Fordo is destroyed, it would certainly be seen as a defeat for the regime, with most of the nuclear infrastructure apparently damaged. Although the regime wouldn't admit that, they would put the best face on it possible, paint resistance as a victory. Whether Fordo survives or Fordo doesn't survive, I think I would judge that their strategy would be something like to seek to end the hostilities as quickly as possible, reinstitute some sort of diplomatic process on the nuclear issue again, and under the cover of that process, seek to get things back as much to the status quo ante as is possible. Now, all of this would be, under a flurry of words and propaganda. Now, you Jonathan, you said you cover regime change later, but certainly, severe damage to Fordo and the other facilities, I think, would call into question, in a way that hasn't been called into question to date, the solidity of the security forces and the revolutionary guard. So, whatever the outcome, they'll put the best face on it. But if Fordo was destroyed, they'd be slapping a lot of lipstick on a pig.
Ambassador, perfect transition for us for where I wanted to take this next. Ambassador McCare, you heard what Ambassador Shapiro, his views kind of from both the U.S. perspective, the Israeli perspective, in terms of what it may mean for regime change. Lipstick on the pig, I think, best comment so far, clearly, and that'll be the highlight to clip for us here from Ambassador Foley. What is the potential for the street of what that looks like right now in Iran in terms of regime change? Is this actually something that, even if not intended, is possible if the Israelis or the U.S. continue strikes and it continues to diminish the regime's standing, continues to diminish their actual physical capabilities, security capabilities, defense capabilities? Or are we taking this a bridge too far, given what the Iranian population's focus might be on right now is frankly their own personal security, and how they're viewing an external actor versus something that comes internally?
Hmm. Yeah, well, I mean, I agree with Ambassador Shapiro's characterization of the regime as being brittle. I think the thing about brittle regimes is you never know when they're going to crack and what's going to cause it. And I think we should all be pretty humble about our ability to predict that in the case of Iran. But having said that, I mean, it's pretty clear that it might not be a stated objective of the Israeli actions, but it's clearly a very much desired outcome of the actions they're taking. And I think there's a lot of wishful thinking in it. And I think we'd all be delighted to wake up tomorrow and find that the regime is gone. But the truth is that, for what we're hearing out of Iran is that the early strikes and taking out IRGC generals and some of the nuclear facilities may have gone down pretty well with a lot of the people of Iran who really, obviously, the majority of them have absolute contempt for their regime. This is now an attack on the country. Once you start attacking oil facilities and oil depots and state institutions like the broadcaster, even if people don't like the state broadcaster, I think it feels like they're just under attack. I don't think that's in any way prompting more likelihood of people rising up and overthrowing the regime. And I don't think people rising up and overthrowing the regime is a very realistic prospect anyway. And to say we can always be wrong about these things, but that people have been very courageous in coming out on the streets protesting about particular issues. People desperately want change, and they don't like the regime at all. But the idea of a revolutionary change that brings chaos is something that is at the top of a lot of Iranians' minds. If you talk to ordinary Iranians of all walks of life, they're very conscious that they've seen what's happened with civil wars after revolutions in Syria and Iraq and in Libya, and they've had their own revolution, which didn't work out too well for them. And I just think that isn't like the way things are likely to change. So the phrase regime change, I think, is quite a misleading one sometimes because people mean different things by it. We should probably think about a change coming in Iran through someone in the military hierarchy stepping forward and taking over more overtly. The IRGC already have a lot of control over the regime from behind the scenes. It is possible to imagine that they could come forward and take over direct control and say to the Ayatollahs, thanks very much for the last 40 years, but we've got it from here. You can go back to the seminary and we'll run this country. And then they could use that to bring in some of the sort of reforms of things like the hijab and make it less of a theocracy. But it wouldn't be a regime that would probably be any better for Western interests or any better for the people of Iran in terms of their rights. And certainly, a chaotic collapse as a result of this military action, if that were to happen, would be pretty disastrous for the region. It'd be disastrous for Europe in terms of refugee flows. It'd be disastrous for the markets. It would be, it's a country of 90 million people. It's a very significant player. And I think, this I say, the talk about regime changes is sometimes a little bit fanciful because it just kind of implies that the regime falls and you get a better, more democratic government in its place rather than a military rule or chaos and a fracturing of the country. So that would be my take on the regime change question. Others may disagree, but if I could come back to the previous discussion just very briefly, I mean, if you're talking about whether Israeli objectives for this action, whether the destruction of Fordo is the fundamental decider of whether it's been a success or failure, I would have thought that would be the wrong way to look at it, because they would probably want to look at it as being, say, success or failure is whether Iran comes out of this determined to rebuild their nuclear program. Because however damaged it has been by military action, it's quite possible that the regime will say, people have gone through decades of sanctions for this to suffer for this nuclear program and military conflict. This is so fundamental to our sort of ideology and our sort of national self sort of vision, self-image, that we have to pursue that. That means including enrichment. But if you came out of this military action with an agreement or the ceasefire that led a pathway towards an agreement, and that agreement shipped out the high enriched uranium that they've been enriching, and kept the enrichment under very close IAEA monitoring to below 3.67%. I mean, that works. I mean, it's been shown to work under JCPOA. That is actually a very effective control over Iran's nuclear program. So I'd say that's the binary in terms of success of the operation, rather than do you or don't you take out Fordo. That'd be my view.
Ambassador, thank you. I think that's actually a perfect transition to where I want to take this next, as it continues on that same path. Ambassador Hopton, what is at the end to this Iran's response? Let's bound this a little bit. As a former career Intel guy, I'm always big on scenarios, so let me just give you one instead of four of them. If the Iranian regime remains largely intact, what does it mean for Iran, for where Iran is going forward? What does it mean for what their thinking is about their next actions? Do they try to rebuild their nuclear program? Do they try to rebuild their proxy network? Ambassador Romanowski said, I thought very thoughtfully earlier, that we've largely seen the proxy network almost largely mitigated. What happens next in Iran's view of where we should go?
Well, first of all, let me just start by saying I agree with Rob's cautionary note about talking about regime change. I think we've got to be very careful what we wish for, and the potential for a harder line military regime replacing the theocratic leadership of the present is certainly one possible scenario. So I think the Israeli government, but also others in the West, should be careful about how they talk about regime change, given our experience in the last quarter of a century. At the same time, I think it is, in my view, something fundamental has changed in the last week. In terms of what the Islamic regime will be in the future. And obviously that can range right across the spectrum in terms of complete disappearance and replacement by something else. We've seen Reza Pahlavi stepping up again publicly, saying he's ready to come and lead a transitional government. In answer to an earlier question, though, there doesn't seem to be a unified consensus around any opposition leadership, and the opposition both in and outside the country is still fragmented. But I think, so I don't see that necessarily as being the most likely of scenarios at this stage. At the same time, I think the Islamic Republic, the regime has changed fundamentally, and is unlikely to be able to return to where it was before. Into whether that's in terms of nuclear enrichment, whatever the outcome, it seems likely, even if some nuclear capability is allowed to remain at Fordow or somewhere else, it will be verified to the hilt by the IAEA and others, I would imagine, as part of the outcome of this. And even if there is no nuclear ambition, whether civil or military, left in Iran after this conflict, I think that the nature of the regime may well change, whether for better or for worse. I was struck in particular, I think there's a lot of maneuvering already taking place, Jonathan, inside the country, and a lot of thought, as I said right at the beginning. I think there's as much thought about options taking place probably in Tehran as there is in Washington, although the options are far more limited in Tehran at this point. And it was interesting to see yesterday that the Prime Minister equivalent, President Pezeshkian, I understand, recognized Israel, the state of Israel. Now, that would suggest a fundamental shift in posture towards Israel, whatever the outcome of this war. In a way, some might say it's a pity that step wasn't taken 2 weeks ago. It might have less bloodshed. But I think it's just indicative that there are moderates, not necessarily reformers, but moderates within the regime And I would imagine there are a number of them inside the government of Pezeshkian, including perhaps the foreign minister, who will be looking for creative ways of adapting the regime so that it survives, so that it can have a future with or without a nuclear capability.
I'd like to take a second. We've got a number of questions flowing in. I'm going to get to them shortly. And if you haven't submitted one yet, but you'd like to, at askac.org, you can do so, and we'll be turning to them in just a few minutes. But while I have the five of you here, I'd like to play a little bit of a game of ambassadorial roulette. For our British and American friends, I'd like you to pretend, if you could, sorry, our British and Australian friends, I'd like you to pretend you are Americans for the moment. I'm going to start with you, Ambassador Hopton, coming off of the comments you just made on the Iranian side. What is your advice in terms of what President Trump should do next, if anything?
Thank you, Jonathan. And sadly, I'll have to drop out after this comment, but it's been a pleasure to be with you all today. You won't surprise you, Jonathan. After 35 years as a British diplomat, I would be advising President Trump to push home his advantage, and that the national interest of the United States of America, however one defines that, but the national interest of the United States of America and its close allies is negotiation, strike a deal, demand as much as you can possibly get, and I imagine President Trump will do that. Dress it up in a way that the other side can accept it and publicly accept it, and move into a different phase. Declare victory, yes, but allow the other side some wriggle room as well. Don't go for a Weimar Republic style victory. Go for a Second World War style Bretton Woods institutions approach, which allows a more peaceful, optimistic future, stability in the region, and a better future for the Iranian people. But that will achieve US interests and not be solely focused on what Prime Minister Netanyahu says should be the outcome.
Ambassador Hopton, thank you. Ambassador Romanowski, what should President Trump do next?
Well, I do think that I have to agree with Ambassador Hopkins that I think we need to, and I would be advising President Trump to lean in as hard as he could on diplomacy to bring them to the table. And again, finding a way that, as you move forward, any efforts by the Iranians to reconstitute their program will be, pretty transparent. They can't do it. And, put some serious teeth into these agreements that really will show everyone in the region and in the world that there's progress. Short of being able to get the Iranians to the table seriously, on that, I think that that there are ways in which objectives can be reached that we don't need to get into now, but that would be as a very, very, very last resort.
Ambassador Shapiro.
I think obviously the preference would be to achieve the outcome that the president set at the negotiations before the hostilities started, which is to have Iran's nuclear program sufficiently contained and dismantled to the point that risk of an Iranian breakout is no longer. Of course, he had set zero enrichment. The talks seemed to have hit a stalemate on that basis. What was always necessary, though, to have that succeed through those negotiations was a credible threat of force and the use of that as leverage to move the Iranians off of their position, which was that they had to sustain this nuclear breakout capability and this enrichment capability. So, it was, I don't think, sufficient in the earlier stage that it was present, that there was that credible threat of force in almost any circumstance. For those negotiations to have been successful, the talks would probably have had to reach a crisis point, and that might have maybe been this fall when the snapback of sanctions under the JCPOA might have been triggered, and Iran might have responded to that. in some way. But that's how these negotiations go. You don't get your outcomes without going through some sort of crisis. We're now in a crisis in a different way because of the commencement of the hostilities. If President Trump wants to draw the Iranians back to the negotiating table, I think that's very advisable, and I would certainly support that. But I think he should use the leverage of the possibility of U.S. military involvement, including particularly to address the Fordo facility, as part of that discussion or part of the motivation to try to bring the Iranians back to the table more flexible than they were in the first phase. Now, of course, a credible military threat's only credible if you're prepared to use it. So there has to be serious consideration about what would be the moment or what would be the trigger or the decision point on which to make that actual decision. But knowing that it's possible, knowing that the forces are available, in fact, I think he has done that. I think he has arrayed the forces that he would need to carry out that strike. There's a second aircraft carrier on its way to the region. There are additional tankers and fighters already in position. Of course, the actual munition and platform that would carry out the strike doesn't need to be deployed ahead of time, but all of the rest of the array is in place. So I think he actually has created that option for himself. I don't think he's made the decision, but the deployment of the option should be part of the leverage of the negotiations.
Ambassador Foley, 3 votes for diplomacy so far, unsurprising from this esteemed group of diplomats, but Ambassador Shapiro talked at the end as well about the potential for President Trump's options being open and the movement of U.S. assets into the region in case he made a decision to engage militarily. Your thoughts? What would your advice be to President Trump on how to approach this moment?
Thanks, Jonathan. Turkeys don't vote for Christmas, and diplomats will always vote for diplomacy. I'd advise in that situation that the president tries to set a framework that enables an Iranian climb down that would enable the dismantling or the severe control of the program. That, as Ambassador Shapiro said, and you hinted at, is will obviously require the motivation of having a big stick available and being willing to use it. I think some of the diplomacy that the president should think about is frameworks that obviously stop Iran building back the program, but also rebuilding its proxies. So a lot of work on the fragile states where those proxies were previously operational. But also, how can something be constructed that meets the aspirations of the Iranian people for some sort of international involvement in the economy without enriching the regime? And that would probably involve some sort of creative diplomacy and creative thinking about sanctions and keeping them in place, and in some cases and not in others.
Okay, and last, I think maybe it won't be surprised. We'll see where this ends up. Maybe it'll be a shocking answer here. Ambassador McCare, what should President Trump do next?
Yeah, well, I mean, as you say, if you assemble a group of diplomats, you're going to get one set of answers to this. If you have a group of generals in this, you might have a different set of answers. So, I mean, I think it's, I would advise the president to be clear what he wants. And sometimes not being clear what he wants has been a tactic that he's used deliberately and has said that he's used in international affairs. And sometimes that's effective. But the mixed signals about whether the US would accept a very constrained Iranian enrichment program, or it had to be dismantlement of all enrichment. I mean, this is such a fundamental question in those negotiations. If they get back into those talks, it would just be really good to be clear about what the US wants and to be clear what's in the US national interest as opposed to necessarily what's the Israeli position. And I think if I were advising President Trump, I'd also be advising him about the risk of being drawn into military action because of the threats that you issue. So I think, again, thinking about the president and the way that he's approached a number of issues. It's very often been to issue blood-curdling threats and then step back from them and accept a deal and to have to get what he wants through a sort of a shock and awe approach. But when you're deploying the assets into the region to, as Ambassador Shapiro was saying, that enable you to really get involved in this conflict, it will be a mistake for the president probably to end up in a position where he feels he has to use them because Iran hasn't done X or Y, and to be sort of drawn down that path. In other words, to assume that they will cave without thinking about what it really means if they don't. And then it's a really difficult decision then for the US about whether it is worth it to be to be using the bunker busting munitions on Fordo, and then if Iran retaliates against US forces in the region, and then you end up with further escalation. What does that, is that really what the president, wants, and what his supporters want in the US? So I think that those would be my words of advice, which I'm sure the president would listen to very carefully if he had the chance.
I'm sure he would. Maybe he's watching now. Let me turn to some of the audience questions that we have, and there's quite a few. So apologies if you're out there. If you've asked a question, we don't get to it. My apologies. Thank you all for submitting them. The first one is from Angus Belair. He asks, there will be long-term repercussions for Israel, whatever the outcome in Iran. What would the diplomats think would be some of the repercussions for its neighbors in the GCC especially? Ambassador Romanowski, maybe I'll start with you.
Well, obviously the answer ends up very much with how this all concludes. But it is, the long-term implications, I think, are essentially to get back to stability across the region. I think the issue, and Ambassador Shapiro may differ with me on that, but I think that's also what the Israelis would like to see. They over the last, well, since basically October 7th, they've been the impact has been to really try to change the environment in the region so that Israel and the region can get back to some kind of a mutual state of sort of what's in each other's benefits if they conduct relations. It's going to take a long time to repair that. But what is a little bit surprising is in all of this recent conflict, you don't see the Gulf, the citizens of the region really taking to the streets as they have in the past. And I think that everyone is worn out by that, and they would much rather see a solution to this. There will be long-term implications, but the region is complicated, and it will come back. It'll sort of bring itself back to some kind of equilibrium. This time it may take longer, but I think it over the longer term it will.
Ambassador Shapiro, your name was invoked. Let me turn to you. Thoughts for the region, but also let's take the Israel angle if you could. What will this mean for Israel long term and its own perceptions of its security?
Well, I think there's just a fundamental shift in Israeli thinking, and it's not just the government, it's also the military, and it's also the society post-October 7th. And that is that threats that previously Israel might have felt they were aware of and could manage and could suppress and maybe mow the lawn, as it's sometimes described, simply cannot be allowed to fester, especially if they pose particularly any kind of existential threat, but even maybe slightly below that. That the mistake or the error of the lack of attention and the lack of vigilance for what Hamas prepared on October 7th is something that simply can't be allowed to be repeated. So, of course, during the course of the war, they eventually took to Lebanon and really did tremendous damage to Hezbollah, discovering in the process, by the way, that Hezbollah had planned something that would have made October 7th look like the warm-up act along the northern border of Israel, not to mention the tens of thousands, well over 100,000 rockets and missiles that Hezbollah had planned. They decimated that to the point where Hezbollah, always considered to be the second strike capability for Iran, has decided to sit this out, at least until now. They don't have the capability, or they don't want to, or there's enough pressure from the Lebanese government to get involved. But that's the logic governing this decision by Israel to go into this mission against Iran, that Iran had simply gotten too close to that capability where they could actually fulfill their threats of trying to destroy Israel. I think it's documented that they, as we've discussed earlier, have essentially a breakout capability on enrichment. That's been true for some time, and they're days away from that. There is some perhaps a slight dispute or different interpretation of various intelligence about how much progress they were making on weaponization, but there's no question that they were shrinking that timeline as well, and that that's the direction of travel, and that rather than wait until the last possible minute and perhaps miss the moment, and then the threat materializes, the Israeli thinking, and again, I think this is why there's so much broad support for this action in Israeli society, including from big, longtime opposition figures and critics of the prime minister on other things, that this simply was too dangerous to be allowed. And so that's why that question of whether Fordo remains operational and they retain that enrichment breakout capability is so critical. And it's why I think, and I did add my voice to the use of diplomacy, but it's got to be diplomacy backed by the threat of force. And ultimately, I think that question that we landed on earlier was, if Fordo remains operational, the campaign really has not achieved its objectives. So I think that weighs heavily on not just Israeli decisions, but also on President Trump's decision, whether we'll end up in a situation where, despite the very impressive gains and successes Israel's had in the week or so that they've been operational, they might be called to end the campaign, and if the U.S. hasn't intervened, with Iran still maintaining that threat that again is sort of deemed unacceptable from the Israeli perspective.
Ambassador McCare, Ambassador Foley, let me turn to a couple of questions back to regime change. It seems to have sparked quite a few questions from our audience, and I'm going to combine a couple of these. One of them talked about the fact, look, Iran is the 17th largest country globally. It's got multiple ethnic groups, multiple folks with there's hugely different religious affiliations throughout the country. What are the real scenarios? How would this even work in a way that would satisfy the actual regime change ideas of the West? And I think, Ambassador McCare, this seems to hint toward, I think, quite a bit of what you were talking about, really this challenge of bringing so many people together at this point in time, that it's quite difficult. So what would that even in practical terms look like if you said you were going to have some sort of regime change that actually satisfies the Western definition of what it is, and not just something different for the Iranian perspective?
Well, it's a good question, because I think that's really what I was saying about the term regime change being a bit of a confusing one sometimes. I mean, the term regime change actually sort of came in, I think, in talking about Saddam Hussein's Iraq, when the Clinton administration wanted to have a policy that wasn't actually going to war with Iraq, but they wanted to see the regime change. And so you talk about different ways that might have happened there. And I think, if you're talking about regime collapse in Iran, which is, the sort of the chaotic and unstructured departure of the current power structures, you're talking about there the collapse of central authority. And I think, as the questioner points out, you've then very rapidly got the Kurds wanting to assert their own, at least, autonomy, the Arab population in the south, likewise, potentially Baluchis, potentially the Azeris in the north, all wanting not necessarily to split off or to join other countries or to have their own republic, but they will want their freedoms and their autonomy. And that's only one dimension of the struggle, and at the heart of the country then got very different views, religious, economic, different factions taking place there, and of course a massive pent-up demand for revenge against the regime. So a lot of violence. It's a regime with its back to the wall. I mean, when the Shah left in 1979, of course, he and all his people around him and his loyalists could all just go off into exile with the money that they had. I don't see many of this regime. There's not many attractive places to flee to. Moscow is not that exciting. And there's not many others. So, they won't do what the Shah did and say, well, okay, that's it, I've had enough. I'm not going to shoot everyone. I'm going to go. They will. They'll use as much force as they need to try and stay in power. So it's a really extraordinarily bloody and chaotic potential that you're talking about if you talk about a collapse of the regime, which is why I think that it's more likely to happen through some sort of palace coup, and then second step, third step, fourth step beyond that, you get unpredictable consequences that might lead to the sort of regime that we would like to see, that the people of Iran would like to see, and it might take some of the shackles off. But the other thing to remember about this, I think, is that there is this massive, incredibly wealthy and incredibly successful Iranian diaspora around the world. And the regime know perfectly well that as soon as things change enough to allow those people to go back in with their capital and their intellectual capital and their connections and their views, that is game over for all the people who have held the wealth and the power of the country since 1979. And so there's no sort of soft way into that for them.
Ambassador Foley, can you follow up on that a little bit? You heard Ambassador McCare talk about the sectarian and religious divisions in the country, how that will influence things. But I think this point on the diaspora is actually quite an important one. How does the regime think through the diaspora, the fear of the diaspora coming back to Iran, and what the implications would be, a game over, as Ambassador McCare said? So what is the regime doing to try to prevent that? And does this create a situation that long-term, where you're really talking about maybe exacerbated by the current situation, is trying to hold the fish too tightly so it doesn't flop out of your hands? How does the regime balancing that?
Thanks, Jonathan. I agree with Ambassador McCare what he has just said on what that would all look like. It would be very bloody. And another factor to bear in mind would be there would at least be some temptation from some neighbors to do some interference in a disrupted Iran, which would have its own effects on regional security. In terms of the diaspora, my guess would be that the regime hasn't given too much thought to the diaspora at all. That particularly the diaspora based in the US, I think they will see as enemies, and I'm not sure that they've given them a lot of attention. I think actually that will be an interesting watch point from now on. How does some of the elements of the regime, perhaps in the IGRC, reach out to some of the wealthier members of the diaspora? But I think that's one of the many blind spots that the regime has.
We're quickly running out of time. There's a question from an audience member I do want to get in because I think it's important. I'm going to ask many of you to go beyond what have been your service in the Middle East to think through your service elsewhere and covering other regions as well. The question is, how are regional powers, Pakistan, India, China, I'm going to add Russia, navigating the fault lines from the war at the moment? And what does it reveal about their strategic priorities and red lines in the Middle East, as well as their goals? Ambassador Romanowski, maybe I'll start with you if I can.
Well, let me just throw out some thoughts on others will, I'm sure. Well, first of all, let me take, China for sure with their investments across the region, particularly in energy. They do not want to see this infrastructure destroyed or their ability to continue to be have the Middle East their predominant resource of energy. So I think and China, when they look at the region, they want to be able to maintain their their relationship. Again, this is one that they see probably much more at this point now a confrontation between the United States and Iran, which they want to stay out of if they can. If a lot of this starts to move into the UN and other international fora, then that they will have to take a position more strongly. But obviously, they just want this over like everybody else does, frankly. On Russia. I'm no Russia expert, but I can't think that the Russians see this again, perhaps as an opportunity for the United States to get embroiled again in a situation that will brings us again, weakens us. And I think from their perspective, from Putin's perspective, that's just fine with him. But let me turn to Pakistan and India just very briefly. Having worked on their relationship and specifically their programs in my past, this is one where they don't want to find themselves anywhere near the same situation. They're going to be watching very carefully how the United States and particularly this administration handles the situation. And I'll let others comment. Thanks.
Ambassador Foley, you served in the region as Australian ambassador to Afghanistan. Let me turn to you. Obviously, bring it wherever you want within the global context, but that seems an important place to start. Some potentially important lessons when you think about Southeast Asia and the implications in China.
Thanks, Jonathan. In terms of Afghanistan, to the extent that the Taliban regime thinks clearly about anything, it would see Iran as a safety valve that takes its people and that enables them to get jobs, to get money, and to go further into Turkey or Europe if required. The Iranian regime has been cracking down on that, returning Afghans recently, as has Pakistan. So I would expect that Afghanistan would hope whatever the outcome that Iran can continue to be the safety valve that it has been for Afghanistan over the years. Pakistan, less. I have less thoughts there, but I think they'll be very cautious, perhaps pleased that what they might see as Iranian interference or dabbling in Baluchistan might be wound back a little. Nothing particular to say on China or Russia. I think Southeast Asia will just hope that the region doesn't blow up and affect energy flows and affect economic growth. But the country that no one's talked about so far, which is the country that perhaps has shown some willingness over the years to be interested in some aspects of its neighbours, is of course Turkey, and I think that will be a close watching.
So wonderful point. We're running a little bit out of time quickly, but I do want to make sure Ambassador McCare and Ambassador Shapiro have a chance to answer this critical question as well. Ambassador McCare, your thoughts on the global diaspora?
So very briefly, I mean, obviously there's been quite a lot of condemnation of the Israeli attacks, but it's been pretty ritualistic from a lot of what you would call middle powers or the old non-aligned. No one really wants to be seen to be the friends of Iran, apart from Russia. I mean, China does, and China obviously wants to keep its relationships on both sides of the Gulf, but they really suck with a long spoon when they're dealing with Iran. Russia is in a different position, and I think Russia's position on this is very interesting because, of course, they do, they can see the potential for the US getting sucked into another mess in the Middle East, and that would be, Putin would be rubbing his hands at that. But they're also looking at the massive degradation of another of their allies. Syria has gone, and if Iran is seriously weakened by this, that's not great for Russia. I think you can well see Russia, see Putin wanting to be involved in some way in the the ceasefire deal of whatever it is, maybe with President Trump. It would be entirely performative. It would be an act of theatre. They wouldn't be doing anything substantive. But you can see his attraction in wanting to try to play that role, maybe even if only as a conduit to Tehran for that ceasefire. But I think it's a complicated position for Russia now, and not a particularly comfortable one.
Ambassador Shapiro, your thoughts?
Just briefly, and picking up on Ambassador McCare's comment, I think President Trump said after his conversation with President Putin the other day that Putin had offered to help with the negotiations. I mean, I'm sure that's something that Israel would view as sort of an utterly unacceptable version of how those negotiations might be conducted, given the now very long established relationship between Iran and Russia as weapons suppliers, one to the other, in both directions. And indeed, I think it should be something that I'm not sure President Trump is as cautious on it as he should be. The ideal outcome from Russia's perspective is keeping Iran just right on the cusp or right on the threshold of nuclear capability, something that ties the United States down. Maybe doesn't have the whole region blow up, maybe doesn't have Iran completely destroyed, but keeps us more or less on the knife's edge as we've been. That's a good outcome for Putin, not a good outcome for the United States or Israel. I would just add one last thought, which is it's been interesting to hear the different European voices under the last few days. Chancellor Metz from Germany was actually quite supportive of Israeli action. He says Israel's doing the dirty work for all of us. And we've all suffered at the hands of Iran's aggression. Macron has been a little bit more leaning toward ceasefires, but I think overall the German, British, French posture on this has been reasonably supportive of what Israel is doing, definitely preferring a diplomatic off-ramp as they were supporting the diplomacy that was happening before the war began. But they were a partner to that as well, because they held the keys to the snapback trigger for later this year in October. If there's a pause of some kind, we may still get back to that, where they have leverage and they have a desire also to see Iran not achieve a nuclear breakout or a nuclear capability. They prefer to be done through peaceful means than non-peaceful means. But I think they've demonstrated that they understand the depth of this problem, and that they should be partners to Israel and to the United States as we find our way out of it.
Well, with that, that's going to be the final word from our panel, and closer from me on behalf of Ambassador Romanowski, Ambassador Foley, Ambassador McCare, Ambassador Shapiro, Ambassador Hopton. Thank you all for joining us for what I thought was a tremendous conversation, incredibly insightful one. Having all 5 ambassadors here provided such a unique perspective, and we're thrilled to have had the opportunity to do it. A lot of questions remaining: Turkey, the E3 snapback, what comes next? We're going to wait and see. We'll try to get everybody back together again, I'm sure, in the near future. Until then, thank you all for joining us. I'm Jonathan Panikoff from the Atlantic Council. Thank you and good night.